Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I'm here as always with B'nai Lappy. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are you?
Good. Great to see you.
Good to see you too.
So I'm really excited about where we're going with this. I'm trying to remember if this was the first sort of like natural progression where we actually didn't like have something on the agenda and in the middle of an episode we said, wait a second, this is the next text. I think we have actually had that once or twice before. But we're going the text that we chose for today, which is from the tractate Brachot, page 19b. It was something that came up in our conversation last week, the last 2 weeks, when we were talking about that text called the quote, the lovesick man, and this idea that the rabbis refuse to allow, the way that I see it is the rabbis refuse to allow a woman to be used as an object to treat a man's condition, whether that condition is real or not, that he thinks that he needs to do something to her, whether that's have sex, view her naked, just talk to her from behind a wall, whatever it is. They're not going to allow her to be used as an object for somebody else's needs without her volition.
Even to save his life.
Even to save his life, which we've
Right.
learned a few times is a principle that trumps everything or almost everything in the Torah. And so apparently, right, so there's versions of, apparently there's a principle even greater than the saving of a life, which we know in the actual laying out of it, there are three, which is not to commit idolatry, not to commit adultery or forbidden sexual relations, and not to murder somebody. And so apparently there's also, and not to whatever this is, and or we can sort of look at this as some other category as well. I mean, it amounts to more or less the same thing, but we could say like there's apparently this other category that also trumps, not only that trumps everything else in the Torah by implication, but trumps the thing that trumps everything in the Torah, right? Along with those three other exceptions, that's so important, but yet it doesn't even seem to be written in the Torah,
Right.
which is this dignity idea.
That's right. And might even trump the exceptions.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Right. So at that point, you said, "Wait a second, there is a text, that says that." And so what we were thinking that we were going to do today is look relatively briefly, at the specific text and line that popped into your mind, and then we're going to kind of zoom out and look at it in its context, the larger stuff that's going on that page and what the rabbis are dealing with, and how, and this might take us till next week also, that we might also see kind of a generational shifting of openness and closeness, and there's a lot of stuff going on there that I think ultimately will be important in additional ways for what we're doing here.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so let's take a look first at this text, and we should note that this what's being quoted here on this page of Talmud, again, to remind you that it's Brachot 19b, is what's called a Breita. And you want to say a little bit about, just to remind, what a Breita is?
Yeah. So a Breita is any teaching by any sage during the first post-biblical period. That's between the years approximately 70 and 220. So this is post-destruction, and this group of sages, the early rabbis called Tanaim, that first era of them were considered very, very, very authoritative in this new version of Judaism called Rabbinic Judaism. And anything they said had the authority of law. Some of what they said got gathered into the first post-biblical book, Torah 2.0, called the Mishnah. And all of that is for sure considered foundational, authoritative, and, can't be overturned. And then there's other material from these sages that wasn't included in the Mishnah. We're not sure why, but is equally considered authoritative. So a Baraita is literally, it means outside in Aramaic, and it refers to any teaching of this absolutely authoritative period that is outside of the Mishnah, wasn't included in the Mishnah. But it seems that its non-inclusion in the Mishnah does not make it any less authoritative. And when the Stama, the editor of the Talmud, pulls in a Baraita, and we only know of Baraitas because the Stama includes them in the Talmud. It's basically to say, hey, this is authoritative. So this is going to trump anything that any later, like Amora, any later rabbi said. So that's a Baraita. This is a very heavy duty Torah truth, but not in the Torah.
Yeah, and I would say it's an imperfect analogy because the Constitution is in American law more authoritative, but in a way it's a little bit like the Federalist Papers or something like that, something that's contemporaneous, that is written by the same people, and that really carries significant weight. In the Jewish tradition, the Braitot are more authoritative than the Federalist Papers are in American law. So here. And by the way, in the Talmud, there's this phrase tashma, in English gets translated come in here, that is used to introduce a piece of material from that generation. It could be the Mishnah itself. It could be a Braita, right?
Typically, it's a Baraita.
Okay. So here it says, come in here. And here's the quote: "Great is human dignity as it overrides a prohibition in the Torah." So human dignity is so important that it overrides any of the prohibitions in the Torah.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. First of all, human dignity. Let's look at the term used in Hebrew for human dignity. It's kivod habriot. So we know kivod is a form of the word kavod, honor, like kibud av ve'em, honor of one's mother and father, kavod harav, honor to one's family. This is kavod habriot, honor due to briot. And briot are things that have been bared, meaning created. And that's the word used to indicate created by God. So I think there's a suggestion here in the word briot that the honor due to creatures created, things created by God, is that maybe the honor due to them, us, is precisely because we were created by God and not due to any personal, professional standing or status. So it's not because someone's a Rav that they get honor. It's not because that they're elderly. It's not because of any particular thing. It's just because you're a created being. God made you, and I think by virtue of that, you're due honor. So that's a big statement, I think. And okay, so the honor due to human beings just because God created us, and I think there's that implication that we're created in God's image and are valuable and worthy of dignity by virtue of that. Okay.
And here it's translated as human dignity.
Yeah.
Is that sort of because it's used as a term of art for human, or in principle, could we translate that as perhaps the dignity of all created beings, including animals or even the earth?
I think for sure. It's commonly used to refer to people generally, like mankind. It's like mankind, but technically it means all created things. So I think you're right. It could be a category that we eventually expand to.
Yeah, right. Because I guess I want to, I mean, there's other terms of art that we know in English, whatever, that sort of don't mean what the words mean. And they've come to mean a term of art, but you could go back and say, well, we've got a hook here, and the rabbis have certainly hung their hats on much less than the actual meaning of a word. So the actual meaning of the term here is the honor due to those that are created.
Exactly.
The creations, whatever those
creations. Good. Okay. So this Baraita is saying that so important, we are so concerned with human dignity that if human dignity is on the line, it is preferable to violate a prohibition in the Torah, a don't do. Anything the Torah says don't do, you can actually go ahead and do it if by not doing it, in other words, following the Torah's prohibition, you would cause someone significant indignity or disrespect.
Right. And we actually have a Rashi for this. And Rashi, is it 11th century Rashi lived?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so it's a commentary from 500 years, well, more than 500 years after the Breita would have been stated, but let's say 500 years or so after the Talmud would have been written. And so, take it what it is, but it's traditionally the most significant commentary. So what Rashi says here is, this is what you should think. All cases of do not do is what was meant. So just what you said, I mean, just that it's everything in the Torah that kind of is thou shalt not, whether that's stated explicitly or not, but anything that the Torah says you shouldn't do, you actually can do if the opposite action would have caused harm to human dignity.
Right. So Rashi's bringing down the traditional understanding of the phrase don't do. And I think the reason Rashi goes to the trouble to put a sharp point on the fact that don't do means every single one of the don't do's is because a person could make the case that don't do refers to only one particular don't do, or only some of the don't do's. And Rashi's saying, no. When that Baraita says human dignity overrides do not do, it means every single do not do in the Torah. So that's the given of what this Baraita means. That's on the table.
All means all. Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, when we say, like, how do you understand?
I'm not sure if, let me look at the Baraita. The actual Baraita doesn't say the word all. That's what Rashi is making clear. The Baraita says, so great, gadol kavod habriot, so great is human dignity, shedoche lo ta'aseh shebat Torah, that it overturns, pushes off, abrogates, supersedes, do not do that's in the Torah. And Rashi says every single do not do.
Because you could read that to say it overrides a particular do not do. We just aren't sure which one. It doesn't say which one. And then the debate would be, well, which one is it that it overrides? And Rashi saying that's not the right way to read it. You read it as the do not do's. All of
right. And I just want to say how we have to point out how shocking this is, because if you go back to the scene in Nitzah's attic where the rabbis decide that you can violate any law in the Torah with 3 exceptions, murder being one of them, right? In order to preserve a life. This is no exceptions. Right. There are no carve outs here. It's not, but of course, don't murder an innocent person. This is anything the Torah says not to do, you actually can do and must do, rather than violate the dignity of a person.
Although I would raise a question about, like, are they serious about that? Because, for example, do not murder is one of the things, one of the do not do's. And would the implication here be that you should murder somebody if it's preserving of the dignity of somebody? I'm
not sure. Maybe we're supposed to know the Nitzah's attic teaching and know that those exceptions apply. I'm honestly not sure. It is hard to imagine. It could be that this is just a hyperbolic statement and wasn't ever meant to be taken literally. It's hard to imagine the rabbis really wanting us to, in fact, murder an innocent person rather than, shame someone. Maybe a case could be made that this doesn't refer to a specific individual, but mankind, humankind generally. And if you're going to somehow I'm not sure. Sure. I think it's a good question.
It's interesting that Rashi doesn't pick up on that question. You would think that Rashi might have said, by this we mean all do not do's, except of course the 3 exceptions of the, but he doesn't.
And we don't have any history in the Gemara of anyone pushing back on Well, we do.
Mhm.
So that's what we're going to see today.
Uh-huh. Right. So
Okay.
the other question that I had, whether you understand it this way, like when it says that it overcomes any do not do, what about the you should do? You know, the positive commandments, like you know, you should put on tefillin if you are praying.
I,
You know, does that mean that if you know it would cause harm to dignity of somebody if you put on tefillin, you should do it anyway? Like I'm not sure. That doesn't seem right.
I think you can violate the do's is a kal vachomer from you can
Right.
violate the don'ts. In other words, violating a don't do, and that issue is going to come up in the Gemara today. So we should maybe get out some vocabulary on that now.
Okay.
Violating a don't do is a much more serious transgression than failing to do a positive commandment. Failing to do something that you're commanded to do is a passive, less severe transgression. And these two kinds of transgressions, actively violating, doing something that you're not supposed to do, and failing to do something, they have names, categories. So the less severe one is called shev v'al ta'aseh, sit and don't do. Let's say the obligation is to light Shabbos candles. If you don't, you've sat there and not lit the Shabbat candles. Okay, you've transgressed the commandment to violate Shabbat candles. But it's a less severe violation than what's called a kum v'aseh. Get up and do. Get up and do is when you got up and actively did something that you were forbidden to do. Murder is an example of kum v'aseh. That kind of active transgression is considered much worse. So if the much worse, more severe transgression is permitted to avoid violating someone's dignity, I think all the more so the implication is that a passive failure to actively fulfill a mitzvah is also permitted.
So then by implication, the reading of this Breita is essentially great as human dignity as it overrides anything in the Torah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. That's a good point. And I think it specifies lo ta'aseh to foreclose the possibility that someone reading or hearing you can violate anything in the Torah. They'll go, oh, certainly that only refers to the don't sit and passively don't do things. But to dafka specify the lo ta'aseh is to say even the most severe active transgressions are permitted rather than. Okay,
so having established this as the kind of fulcrum of this discussion, we want to then now sort of zoom back to the beginning, see it in its context, and then talk about the implications of whether this really is the law at the end of the day, or I shouldn't say the law, the tradition, whether the weight of the tradition ultimately stays with this Breita or isn't sure or somewhere else. And what do we make of that? I mean, these are all the questions that will come up, but what we thought we would do is first kind of look at this in the context of this much larger section in the Talmud, and then again, it may be today and maybe next week that we'll really have time to dig into the implications. So,
and let's not forget when we get to implications, or at some point, to flesh out some examples of what a violation of human dignity might look like. And that's a topic that they get into as well. In other words, does it have to involve a person's awareness that they've been shamed? Can a sleeping person be shamed? What about a dead person? They say actually the dead body, you can shame the dead body. Obviously, you're not shaming a dead body. You're shaming the standards of human conduct. So it doesn't require even the experience of embarrassment. It's a much bigger concept, but we should flesh out some examples at some point.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, right, the example that brought us here, which isn't talked about in this text, but the example that brought us here was that idea that a woman could be required even to speak with a man from behind a fence in order to cure his deadly. Still don't know what the deadly illness is that he has, but anyway. So okay, so let's start. So
Okay.
So that we didn't bring the specific Mishnah here, but they're talking about a Mishnah that's talking about a
That occurred a few pages before.
Right. So it's talking about, basically, as I understand, it's a funeral, and there was a practice where, and I guess there's still, I don't know exactly if we still do this exactly this way, but there's sort of people would line up in a row, and the dead body, the shrouded body, I guess, would be brought through in between these rows of people.
Yeah, and we many people still follow this custom of lining up in, the comforters line up in 2 rows between the hearse and the burial site, both when the mourners and the deceased go to the burial site, and do the same thing again, line up in this facing one another kind of 2 rows when the mourners leave the cemetery. But I have a feeling that there was an additional use of this 2-row situation, because Rashi says that the mourners would sit in the center. So I don't think it's the 2 rows through which the mourners pass, only through which the mourners pass. Maybe in the Shiva house there was some arrangement like this, because obviously going from the road to the burial site, you're not going to be sitting, but Rashi says they were sitting, so not sure.
So in any event, there was this practice that was my understanding of the connection to dignity here is that the idea was this is a way of honoring the dead person in a very important way.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's only honoring the dead person or it's honoring of the mourners. I have this feel, there's a debate about what really is what's going on between the people in the rows who are facing the mourners and the mourners. Like what mitzvah are they really being engaging in here? Are they comforting? So that's going to be a topic, but
but it's basically seen that they're there for someone else. They're there to be affirming of the dignity of someone else, whether it's the dead person or the mourners. And the issue is that the time is, look at the clock. Look at the clock. It's time to say the Shema, and then it's like they're in the middle of this thing, but the time to say the Shema has come. I mean, that's from the Torah, so we better take a pause here and let's everybody say the Shema. And that would potentially not be a very welcome event for the mourners, that all of a sudden they're not it's not, the funeral isn't the center of what's going on. All of a sudden everybody's taking a break for the Shema, which you would think maybe that is how it should be, because God is more important and the time has come, and so let's all take a break and then we'll go back to the funeral. But the Mishnah says that no, actually the people who are in these rows are not required to say the Shema that day or at that time when the funeral is happening.
Well, it turns out, as we're going to see, some of them are actually required to peel off and say their Shema, and some are not. And the question is, who's required and why are they required, and who's not required and why are they not required to say the Shema? And so this is the beginning of our entry into kind of the conflict of laws and values, right? We have a value of doing what the Torah says to do, say the Shema, and we have and that's in conflict with comforting the mourners and the dignity of the mourners, right? Because it would be an affront to their dignity. I think this is what's being hinted at, to here come the mourners and you're like, sorry, and turning your back and going over to the other side of the field and saying your Shema. Okay.
Right. I guess just parenthetically, for those who don't know where the wink was in what you said, it's not really clear that the Torah says that you should say the Shema, but
exactly.
But it might be, and the rabbis think say that it is, so
That's right.
we'll go with that.
Exactly. You interpreted the wink correctly.
So the sages taught this works more in the Tosefta. So here again is another case of a Braita. So the Mishnah says they're exempt from the Shema, but there was another material from the contemporaneous time that says some are exempt and some aren't, like you said. So the consolers standing in a row from which one sees inside the area where the mourners are passing are exempt. So the inside layer don't have to say the Shema, because those are the people that the mourners are seeing, and they would be upset if those people peeled off and said the Shema. So they don't have to say the Shema. And those standing in a row from which one does not see inside are obligated. So if you're standing second row, third row, maybe further back where the mourners really can't even see you, then they're not going to notice. And in that case, not only may you, but you must, that if the time for the Shema comes, you need to say the Shema. So that would suggest that like you were saying, that the dignity being concerned about here is the mourners, that their sense of whether you're paying full attention to them or not. And if they can't see you, then they're not going to have those feelings of that you're not caring about them, and then you should say the Shema.
I think that's what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not the only ones who are not quite sure what's going on, because here comes Rabbi Yehuda and he says, wait a minute, I think what's going on is something altogether different from the question of whether you're, comforting the mourners in a dignified way. Let's see what he says.
Right. So Rabbi Yehuda says the consolers standing in the row, any row, I guess, right, who come on account of the bereaved are exempt. So if you're there, because you actually cared about the person who died, then you don't have to say the Shema. But if you're there out of curiosity, and then you do have to. If you're just there because something was going on and you wanted to be part of the crowd. By the way, like, we laugh about it, but I mean, if somebody prominent dies, there's a lot of people that are there for that reason, to see the funeral cortege pass by, right? So they are there not because they're so upset about the person who died. They're just there because it's happening. They have to say the Shema, according to Rabbi Yehuda.
Exactly. And what this brought to mind for me is something that they don't say explicitly, but I remember learning the concept that ha'osek b'mitzvah patur min hamitzvah. One who's engaged in a mitzvah is exempt from some other mitzvah whose time might have come precisely at that moment. So it seems that what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is, if you're actually there to do the mitzvah of nichum avelim, whether the mourners see you or not, and are actually aware of you or not, you're osek b'mitzvah. You're engaged in a mitzvah. If you're engaged in a mitzvah, that mitzvah, you don't have to go off and do the mitzvah of Shema. But if you're only there out of curiosity, and presumably whether or not the mourners actually see you peel off or whatever, if you're not actually engaged in a mitzvah, because going to a funeral out of curiosity is not a mitzvah, although I want to put a sticky on that, because accompanying the dead, that is a mitzvah, but somehow Rabbi Yehuda is kind of disparaging someone who's coming out of curiosity. That person is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, not engaged in a mitzvah and should go off and say his Shema. Okay.
Yeah, and that means that, like, just if you're in the back row and the mourners can't see you, you don't have to say the Shema if you're there for the bereaved people or the dead person or whatever. If you're there for the mitzvah, if you're right in front of the mourner and they're right next to them, but you're there out of curiosity, you actually do have to peel off and say the Shema, meaning that they might say, oh, that's weird. Why is this person just like, that might be upsetting to the mourners. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that's not the issue. So again, who's, like we were talking about, whose dignity are we talking about here? It would seem that the dignity in question is the dignity of the dead person, because that's definitive. It might be not about dignity at all, but like you say, about the mitzvah. But if it's about anybody's dignity, it's about the dignity of the dead person, because that's going to be the definition of whether or not you should stay and not say Shema. Whereas the earlier point of view of the rabbis was more about the bereaved people, the mourners, because it was really a question of whether they see you or not.
That's right. And this way of doing law is very traditionally Jewish, which is instead of having these clear statements, is that called epidicticla?
I don't know.
Okay. Clear statements of rules. We have cases from which we extrapolate rules and principles. So here's a, we have a case with a ruling, and we have to figure out what's going on there. And from that, we can extract a rule about dignity, mitzvahs. Okay.
Okay, so from this basic case, and this is the Gemara goes on to talk about other cases where there is some kind of conflict between dignity and honor, that kind of thing, and some more explicit or more accepted law or practice.
Yeah. I typically don't like the kind of interstitial explanations in the translations. This one I like.
Yeah, that's why I left it.
Yeah, the Gemara expands the discussion to raise the general question: to what degree does preserving human dignity take precedence over mitzvot enumerated in the Torah? That is exactly what's happening, and that shift is not obvious because it's such a detailed set of moves that it's easy to miss what's really going on in this next section of Talmud. Okay.
Right. Although there's a piece here. So the first person quoted is Rav Yehuda, who was the person who just said, right, that you should peel off and say Shema even if the mourners conceive. So maybe
I didn't even catch that.
Yeah, so maybe he's not so focused on dignity at the end. Maybe that's not really his thing, because here too he takes a kind of a strict position, right? So Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, one who discovers diverse kinds kilayim, that is a prohibited mixture of wool and linen in his garments. So the Torah says you're not supposed to have garments that mix wool and linen.
And this for sure is a written in the Torah in black and white prohibition.
Right. And I just kind of imagine like this person's walking in the marketplace, like picking at his coat. All of a sudden he like notices, like if he said wool comes out, he thought it was a linen jacket, but and then he's like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? My whole outfit is this forbidden kilayim, right?
Yeah, and don't picture a jacket, picture some sort of a tunic.
Right.
Underneath which he's naked.
Right.
I think that's the issue here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So right. So he's right. It's the ancient times. They're wearing like a long, tunic, gown, whatever you call that. Okay. So he must, if he finds all of a sudden that he's wearing kilayim, he must remove it even in the public marketplace. Meaning, like you say, like he's going to be naked in the marketplace. That's obviously undignified.
Exactly. So all of a sudden he discovers he's violating the Torah. Explicitly a black and white prohibition. That's he's doing a don't do. That's bad.
Right. And
Rav Yehuda says he's got to take off. He's got to stop that right now.
Right.
Even at the expense of shaming himself. Even if he's in public, he's in the middle of the shuk, the middle of the marketplace. Yes, better to shame himself than violate the Torah.
Well, because also there's the moment that you know that you're doing it, it shifts from a accident to a intentional violation, right? And the consequences for an intentional violation are more severe, and also the prohibition is more severe if you know that you're doing it, and as soon as you realize that your clothes have this forbidden mixture, you know that you're doing it. So there, it's not just like, you could think, you say, well, look, I had it on all day, I'll just get home and take it off. It's like, no, actually, like it's not that the extra time doesn't matter. It actually shifts the nature of the prohibition once you know that it's happening.
That's right. And everyone, at home, or everyone reading this text who knows that Baraita should be going, that's surprising, because don't we have this Baraita that says, no, you can violate any don't do to not shame someone, including yourself, maybe.
So okay, so Rav Yehuda says you got to strip it off right there. And what is the reason that the Talmud asks? And he says, and his reason that he gave or would have given is to quote from Proverbs that there's a particular statement, there's neither wisdom nor understanding nor counsel against the Lord. The implication being, and we in the sheet we have the Proverbs. I don't think we have to look at it there. Again, as always, it's pretty much out of context. But the basic idea here is that like there's nothing that you in your own human thinking can do to trump something that God has said explicitly. And so even if you think, oh, it's it's dignity, or I can wait till I get home and whatever, there's no logic that you're going to be able to use, right? That's how I understand it. And what God said, if God said it, it said it, and you just got to do it.
Yeah, frankly, I still haven't wrapped my head around how this proof text works. It's just screamingly obtuse, obscure. It's clearly not the pshat, not that impugns any proof. All proofs using verses from Tanakh are taking the verse out of context, twisting it. But this one is, I don't even know. I can't, I don't quite get it. There is neither wisdom nor understanding nor counsel against the Lord. In other words, compared to violating God, to nothing, no logic. It's hard for me to hold my hand here. Ein chokhmah ve'ein tvuna ve'ein etza leneged Hashem. None of these other things, wisdom, understanding, counsel, should be held against God, or held to bear when if that causes you to go against God.
I mean, I just read it as like there's no human wisdom. There's no logic. You can't logic your way out. By the way, this is like also a kind of potentially I wouldn't make too much out of this, but this is a little bit of an affirmation, I think, of how you understand the word svara as being it's not about your thinking. It's not about logic. Svara is this level of moral reasoning that's actually Torah-like. So they're not actually using the word svara here. They're quoting something in Hebrew, so svara is an Aramaic word, but they're not following up on it with an Aramaic explanation that they're talking about, quote, svara here. They're talking about, so I think that what they're talking about is like basic human thinking, logic, the kind of, they're saying like, look, you could obviously, it would be easy to make an argument that if you're going to be naked in the marketplace, like that's not dignified. That's not, that would be shaming. There's something in the Torah that talks about, shaming. You shouldn't shame, shouldn't whiten people's face. Like there's so many ways that you can like logic your way through this. And they say, well, but no, if there's a direct, explicit command from God, then no human thinking logic can overwhelm that. This is a quote from Proverbs. Now, the question is, right, the rabbis misquote all the time to make something, to soften something in the Torah. Here there's a kind of a misquote to harden something from the Torah. It's a little bit unusual in that regard, which also might raise this question of like, at the end of the day, where do they stand? But I don't know. That's how I read it.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me.
So I'm noticing a couple of things. One is that the verse isn't being offered by Rav Yehuda. Or Rav. Rav Yehuda is the student of Rav, and he is teaching this teaching in the name of his teacher. He's saying, my teacher Rav said this thing. And Rav Yehuda, doesn't put forth a proof text. This is the stama, right? The proof text is being introduced with the words my tama. This is Aramaic, unattributed Aramaic, always indicates it's the editor speaking. So the editor, a much later person than Rav Yehuda or Rav, right? Like by 4 centuries or so, is now adding, well, why is that? What proof does Rav Yehuda have, or Rav have, that this guy should peel off his tunic in the middle of the shuk rather than violate the Torah by wearing wool and linen mixed together. And it's the Stama who offers this really forced read on this verse. And, you know, I'm kind of reading it through my David Kramer, my teacher lens, and I'm wondering whether we're meant, as the sort of sophisticated reader, we're meant to see that there's no way that this idea that you should prioritize Torah over dignity really has a basis. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yep.
it's the wink, it's the showing just how unsubstantiated such a, and maybe sort of un-Jewish even, just like that isn't what the Torah wants us to do. I'm not sure.
Well, and then there's sort of like an explanation that's actually in Hebrew. So it's a question of like, where's this from exactly? But it says, you know, so we have this quote from Proverbs. And what the takeaway from that is that any place where there is Chilul Hashem, so actually in the translation it said something like desecration of God's name or something, which technically maybe, but it really, it's more like somehow making God undignified, you know, or something like that, right? That God's dignity, you know, if it's going to be something that somehow takes away God's dignity, then we're not going to do that in order to preserve, and what it says here is the dignity of the teacher, right? So that, you know, that kind of, the way I read that is like, you know, yeah, human dignity is really important, but it also has to be weighed against God's dignity, and in a place where God's dignity would be called into question, then we're going to have God's dignity trump human dignity. But if not, then we'll have human dignity trump God's dignity. What are those cases? You know, and somehow the question is like, maybe this is kind of one of those cases, because somehow this prohibited mixture of wool and linen is so clearly stated in the Torah that, you know, to violate it would be clearly to make God undignified. I don't know, you know, but that's kind of something like that.
Something like that. And now I'm wondering if there's maybe a kal vachomer, meaning a deduction that we can easily make from the typical interpretation of that verse being it's preferable to even shame a teacher rather than God. So if you can shame a teacher, all the more so is it okay to shame a quote unquote ordinary human being. Maybe that's it. It's funny. I'm not quite sure I have it, but this is a very weird position that yeah, but okay,
yeah,
that's what's on the table.
But but at the end of the day, going back to the initial case, right, because it's Rav Yehuda, right, that at least the Talmud is trying to sort of set this up, that the rabbis thought that it was about the sort of dignity of the mourners and their feelings. Rav Yehuda said that it was really just about the dead person, and, you know, a dead person is less, you know, it's obviously not seeing the people in the same way, you know, and then he has this like hard-edged principle that says, right, we're going to be very careful with dignity, and at the very least, the way that I look at this, or one way to look at this, at the very least, like, you know, we know the dead person isn't really, you know, so concerned about those, can't see anybody, let's say, you know, so we're going to go with this harder principle that says, you know, we're going to take this idea seriously, that God's dignity is more important than human dignity, and then we're going to look at these other cases to see.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with you about Rav Yehuda, because he says explicitly, Haba'im mechamat ha'avel, those who come for the mourner, those who come. So I don't think Rav Yehuda is talking about the dead body. I think he's talking about the mourners also.
Okay.
Anyway.
Right. So anyway, let's move forward. So now, again, a little interstitial thing that I thought was helpful. The Gemara cites several sources to challenge this principle, right? So now we've got that hard principle, and now the Gemara is saying, but wait a second, we have these cases where it seems like there are things that are laws that we violate, you know, for dignity. So you say that there's nothing that the Torah says that, that the dignity should, that's too strong. We know that there are cases where you do.
Great. So now, 8 inches of Gemara, and that's a lot, are going to be spent going, whoa, wait a minute, to Rav Yehuda's statement about shame someone, yourself or someone else, rather than violate the Torah. And now the Gemara is going to go one after the other of cases that contradict that idea. Wait a minute. Okay.
So again, another Braita is brought in, and this is the story. So after they buried the deceased and returned, so they go to this funeral. I mean, they go to the burial. They bury the body, and now they're on their way back from the cemetery.
Right.
And on the way back, there are 2 paths before them, one ritually pure and one ritually impure. In other words, that the ritually pure one means that they know that there aren't any dead bodies on that path, and so you're safe to walk through it and not worry that you're going to become impure through contact with a dead body, which is a very severe kind of impurity. And another one that they know that there are dead bodies there, and that you are going to become impure if you go down that path.
Okay, and I think the issue here is that there's an assumption that there would be Kohanim, priests in the crowd, and it is really for the Kohanim that there is a serious concern over becoming impurified because of contact with a dead body. It's forbidden for them to become impurified. Those of us who are not Kohanim, it's not forbidden. Many of us probably know about the pitcher of water that sits outside of the Shiva house. And when you come from the cemetery, you rinse your hands ritually to rid yourself of that impurity. It's not a big deal to become ritually impure because of a dead body if you're not a Kohen. But if you are a Kohen, it's a very serious Torah violation. Okay. So I think this is addressed to the Kohanim in the crowd, but all right.
So if the mourner comes on the pure path, they come with him on the pure path. So they're following the central mourner here, or mourners. And that person is just walking home from the cemetery, and I imagine not thinking too much about which path they're taking. And if they happen to go down the path that the priests know is going to cause their impurity, nevertheless, they follow him on that path. That's about the mourner's dignity.
Right, but we're still in the first part. If the mourner goes on the pure path, everyone follows the mourner.
Oh, if the mourner comes on the pure path, they follow him on the pure path. And if he goes on the impure path, they accompany him on the impure path in order to show him respect.
Right. Even if you're a Kohen and you're going to violate the Torah by respectfully following that mourner down that path. So there's a case that surely seems to contradict Rav Yehuda. Let's call that Rav's position, because Rav Yehuda is saying it in the name of Rav. That contradicts Rav's statement that, oh, no, never violate the Torah, even if you're going to shame someone. Better to shame them rather than violate the Torah. Wait, this case doesn't follow that. This case is saying honor someone even if it causes you to violate the Torah. All right.
And this case is from a Braita, which is more authoritative than Rav. It's earlier than Rav. So we know that if this is a case that is not consonant with his point of view, that he must be wrong, not this earlier case, which is more authoritative.
That's right. Rav is an Amora, even though he's in the swing generation between Tanaim and Amoraim. He's still an Amora, and this Baraita, a Baraita held up against an Amoraic teaching, the Baraita always wins. That's the rule of the game. Okay.
All right. So the Talmud then asks, well, why? Why not let us say here too that there is neither wisdom nor understanding against the Lord? That line from Proverbs, that the dignity of God right here, that the idea that the priest shouldn't become impurified, that should trump the dignity of the mourner.
Right.
Shouldn't go on that path. That's
right. Why does the Baraita say the priest should defile himself? That's a violation of the Torah. Great.
So then Rabbi Abba explains that, so he's trying to limit this case. He's saying, no, this is a very particular case. It's not that they always follow the mourner on any path. It's just that if there is a path through an area where there's uncertainty about whether or not there's dead bodies, buried under the path, that's called a Beit HaPras. So if you are going there, then you can follow. So it's not that if you know that it's impure, then you cannot, should not follow. But if you aren't sure if it's a questionable case, then you should follow, because that prohibition, the idea that a priest, I guess, shouldn't go on a Beit HaPras, a questionably impure road, that's only a rabbinic prohibition. That's, that idea of the fence around the law to make sure that nobody accidentally violates it. So we're going to say, even if you're not sure, you can't go, because then we'll be 100% sure that the priests will never be impurified. That's only a rabbinic law. And so we're saying, so what the Breita is saying is that you can violate a rabbinic law in order to show this respect to the mourners, and not a Torah law. And Rav Yehuda takes it even narrower, right, and says that Shmuel said, interesting that he quotes Rav in one place and Shmuel in the other place, because these are two contemporaries that often disagree, but Rav Yehuda's, selectively quoting here. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, one who passes through a Beit HaPras may blow on the dust, which is, again, like a comical way to walk, that you're walking in every step, you're blowing to sort of see if any bones appear, and as long as you can walk on a Beit HaPras as long as you're blowing the dust before taking each step. And Rav Yehuda Bar Ashi said, in the name of Rav, a Beit HaPras has been trodden underfoot, is pure, and and you don't have to be concerned about it. So these are just examples of limiting, and saying that Breita is actually dealing with a very, very specific situation where you can be sure that it's pure, and then usually for safety, we would say don't walk there anyway. But in this case, because you're quite sure that it's going to be pure, you can do it if it's to preserve the dignity of a mourner.
Right. So I'm not sure what to make of this. This is a classic Talmud move where two stories, two texts, two teachings are in conflict. And in order to resolve them, to say, oh no, they're not actually in conflict, the Talmud narrows the application of one of them so that it doesn't actually conflict, and in fact is true only with regard to a case that is not being dealt with. And I'm asking myself, why does the Talmud want to do that? Why does the Talmud want to continually narrow what is an obviously conflicting teaching in favor of the principle of human dignity, to continue to uphold Rav's teaching about better to not violate the Torah than violate human dignity? I'm not sure what's going on generally.
Well, I would just note that move is not just a classic Talmud move; it's a classic legal move. It's always the case that if you are a judge on a court and you are given a precedent that would go in the direction opposite the one that you want it to go in, whether you want it because you think it's really the right way for the law to be, or because you're politically motivated, whatever the reason is, if you believe that the law ought to go in the other direction, then what you do with a precedent that stands against you, or if you're a lawyer bringing a case, is you narrow the application of that precedent. You say, well, no, that, yes, I understand that if you read that expansively, it would mean that my position would be wrong, but don't read it expansively. It wasn't meant to be read expansively. It was dealing with a very particular case at a very particular time, and we're going to limit its application to those facts in that case and that time, and that's done all the time. Your question, why is that done? It's done because the later judge or the later party doesn't want to be held to that law. They don't like it. And if you think about all kinds of things that are happening in the Supreme Court today, whether it's like an expansion of the Second Amendment or a contraction of things like Roe v. Wade, abortion rights, let's say, you could say, hey, we could overturn Roe v. Wade, but that would be a huge thing to do. You would start all kinds of protests and whatever. If you can say, no, we're just going to limit the application of Roe v. Wade to a very particular situation, and then we're going to say the rest of the landscape is open for these states to make anti-abortion laws and whatever, then it's a much less dramatic thing to do. So it has the feel to me like an earlier court, like the Warren Court here, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, that they radically expanded all these laws, and this is not the Warren Court, but let's say a little bit after was Roe v. Wade. So they made this extremely expansive case that said that you can't limit abortions, and then sometime later, people are like, oh yeah, this is too broad. Like, this is dangerous. This is just problematic, or they're just conservative. This is too liberal, whatever. And you say, okay, well, how are we going to deal with this? And so we're going to have to narrow those cases because we can't just get rid of it completely. That has that feel to me. So then that suggests that the stomma, and we want to sort of locate, like, where is the conservative voice in this story? And if it's the stomma, which is late in the writing of the Talmud, then we might say, well, it seems like what's going on here is that the stomma was uncomfortable with something so broad as human dignity trumps everything in the Torah.
Yeah, that sounds right. Because what that reminds me of is that in the Yerushalmi, and here it is, our very sugya goes the opposite way. We don't have that stamma in the Yerushalmi, and the stamma in the Yerushalmi, we have some kind of stamma.
Just to explain that, the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, was finished about 100 years, 200 years before the Babylonian Talmud. So it's two things. One, it's not the same people. It's not the same editor. And number two, it's not the same time. So something might have happened it's also not the same place, but I mean, something might have happened in the period between when the Yerushalmi closes and when the Babylonian, the Bavli, closes, that changes, right? So just like, a Supreme Court from now and a Supreme Court from 100 years ago might have very different things on their mind.
Yeah, so it could be the time, it could be the place. It could be for some reason in the diaspora, the Babylonian diaspora, they're getting more conservative. I'm not sure, but the Yerushalmi does not limit the cases or the explicit teaching like our Baraita. It has our Baraita here, and it never limits that. And what wins in the Yerushalmi is human dignity, even over violating any positive or negative commandment in the Torah. So, and we've seen this before. Where was it? It was in Eina Ones Begitin in Ketubot, when we learned about the case of the woman who gets a conditional get, and the stomach closes down at the end, the radical statement that, as far as overturning Torah, and in the Yerushalmi, they say, yeah, Svara overturns Torah. So it feels like a similarly conservative move. Yet I love that all of these radical earlier teachings are even in the Bavli, and it's very obvious. I think, as a reader, you chuckle seeing the ways that those radical moves are limited. So,
well, I think that that's a good. So first of all, I guess number one, we'd say, well, and does our case here, the Bavli, does it shut down this law? Or this idea? We'll put that as a cliffhanger for next time. The last thing, though, that in terms of what you said about like the preservation, it's really interesting because it makes me think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg of blessed memory, and almost like dedicating this hour to her, because she would, and she wasn't the only one, but she's the most recent one was very open about that she's putting things in her dissents that she hopes will later be able to be the basis for these changes, whether that changes from a future Supreme Court, or in the case of the Lilly Ledbetter case, the equal pay for women case, she kind of put something in dissent that then got picked up by Congress. She basically said, Congress is going to have to change this if anybody is, and Congress was like, okay, we'll change it. And she, in that sense, like took advantage of the structure of the system, because it could have been that our system didn't allow dissents to be published. But it turns out that our system does allow dissents to be published, and that gives a kind of a weapon to the minority to be able to say, okay, well, then I'm going to bury this in a time capsule for some time in the future. And you could see that one of the reasons why maybe these things are preserved in the Bavli is because that was the system, that was the tradition, and a good one it is from my perspective, right? I mean, like, does that actually, like, if you want to say, what are the things that are really Jewish, what are these things that like are core to Judaism? Apparently one of them is that we don't completely hide the things with which we disagree, and that's part of the system, and that allows voices that we disagree with eventually to come along and take something and make a lot out of it. I would argue that a lot of the way Judaism is practiced today comes from people in more modern recent times pulling stuff out that was actually not the way that Judaism was, but it was preserved as a minority opinion, and they've turned that into a kind of the way it should be. But progressive can do the same thing, and that's part of how the system works, and I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I guess next week we'll get to the big baraita that we started off with, and we'll see where it comes into this conversation and what the Bavli does with it.
Yep. All right. Looking forward to that.
Cool.
All right. See you next week, Benay.
All right.